looking forward to this as much as I have.
Don't hurt my feelings.
I can't wait.
Sure. Now,
Thank you.
I always appreciate it when they bring food, but it's also not a good sign when that happens. So get comfortable.
That's probably true.
You gonna start us, Carter?
Yes, sir. I'd be happy to. Ladies and gentlemen, there's just a few of the documents I want you to be aware of before we really get cracking into this. This right here is the budget narrative that most of my comments will be coming from tonight. A lot of what you see in here may not necessarily come out in our presentation this evening, but as you contemplate the budget and look it over and consider it on a formal basis, hopefully this will be a good resource for you to kind of walk you through a lot of the more major elements. Yes,
That's the narrative, right?
that's it. That's right there. Yep. Of course, you got your budget book here. Some of you picked it up before the weekend. Some of you are getting it for the first time tonight. The other thing that you are getting for the first time tonight is the annual report from the departments and so on. Again, resource material, something to look at on your leisure as you consider the budget and potentially connections there and everything else. We also had some other handouts that I left up here. If I could here. Some of you should have gotten handouts that look like this. Not some of you, all of you should have gotten handouts that look like this. And you also got a couple handouts, I think, one of which looks like this, and like that right there.
That one.
You got just the one? We're missing this one then?
Looks like it, yeah.
Yep.
Well,
Oh, there it is.
stick
Yep.
to the back.
That's it. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I got to stick it backwards. So yeah. Okay. Good. Looks like we're in business then. We're very good. We'll be going through your handouts and, like I said, most of the narrative, and we'll go from there. To start us off tonight, if I could, one of the things that we were asked to cover was with regard to some of the basics as it relates to governmental fund accounting and why it's different and why the environment we operate in is a little bit probably unique compared to other financial environments and so on. I want to start that conversation by directing your attention, first of all, to this sheet right here. This is a breakdown of the very broad financial activity with respect to the funds that we use to operate the city of Casper's financial environment. A couple of the funds to draw your attention to. Fund number one that's actually the general fund. Fund number 14 is that revolving land fund that I talk a little bit about in the budget message. Fund 40 is the water fund, and that's obviously a big one. You'll also see Fund 41 and 42 that make up our sewer wastewater treatment plant operation. And then Fund 43 and 44 are the refuse and Balefill, making up the sanitation operation. And I guess the other one I'd probably have you mark is Fund 65. That's the health fund right there. And for purposes of this illustration, the parenthetical numbers are actually revenue surplus numbers. Unlike what you would probably see, in your own checkbook or whatever when you put parentheses at a number that typically looks like a loss. Those are actually surpluses. You'll also notice at the bottom, the very, very bottom line under surplus deficit column, a $5.7 million surplus. Now, in most cases, when you hear someone say, hey, we've got a $5.7 million surplus, you would think, that's great news. We've got a lot of money to do a lot of cool projects and potential raises with and so on and so forth. Well, in my estimation, the breakdown of that number is very illustrative of how fund accounting works. Because the fact is that $5.7 million is not necessarily dollars and cents that we can use for whatever purposes we might come up with. Because as you'll see, for example, in the general fund, that particular surplus only makes up $127,000 worth of that entire $5.7 million. And as you all know, the general fund is the fund that operates most of our operations. In fact, I'd say that it's probably about 75%, give or take, of our operations come out of that fund. And as I've already discussed, a number of the enterprises make up a number of the other surpluses that this surplus balance accounts for. The problem that you have with regard to operating in this kind of financial environment is that there are typically policies, and statutes, and ordinances and so on that prevent the cross-mingling. And that is a very strong characteristic of a governmental fund type accounting environment. Those typical funds or reporting entities or whatever are the distinguishing factors between regular public accounting and the accounting that you and I work under in a government environment or even a nonprofit environment. Typically speaking, as your cheat sheet here says with respect to the governmental fund accounting sort of primary criteria, the words that I've circled in here are words like segregated, regulations, restrictions, or limitations. The primary difference between governmental fund accounting and the regular public accounting that many of you probably are familiar with as well is that fund accounting is really and truly designed around the principles of accountability versus principles of profitability, like you would see in a typical business or public accounting environment. I appreciate the fund accounting environment because it really does promote transparency. Where you're operating one fund, one business entity, and one ledger with respect to the general fund, you're also doing the same for the water fund and the sewer fund and the sanitation fund. And so you're effectively balancing all those funds against their individual activities, and the sharing of those funds between those entities have to be done by some sort of regulatory caveat. Again, unlike public accounting in many cases. If you'll switch the sheet here, looking to the major categories of funds that we operate with, while the terminology is slightly different, you'll recognize the purposes very, very quickly. For example, in governmental funds, that generally speaks to our general fund. When you talk about proprietary funds, you are talking about enterprise funds for our purposes. And then, of course, we do have fiduciary funds as well. The biggest example is with regard to the dollars that we hold on to on behalf of the Amico Reuse Joint Powers Board. And those of you who served on that board understand that relationship very well. This is an example of why we have multiple ledgers versus a single sort of self-balancing account that a business will typically have. So as an example, when we talk about the 1% fund, we talk about the ways in which 1% cannot offset the costs and expenses in, say, the general fund or the water fund without some sort of directive by this group, sort of the board of directors right here. And when we do get that policy, when it happens and when it's appropriate and so on, we use that as kind of our guiding principles to establish the budget off of and so on. Just like in the water department, we don't typically look to the water department to simply balance the operations in the general fund, although there are policies in place that allow us to use water funds wherein they are buying services from the general fund and its operations. Tom's services, for example, are bought from the water fund. And that is allowable not only by your policy oversight, but by statute and everything else. And so those kinds of policy directives are really critical when it comes to the governmental fund environment that we operate in. To direct your attention to the other worksheet real quickly, the general fund, of course, is a big part of what we discuss in this work session. because the general fund tends to be our most vulnerable, least controllable fund that we have. And ironically, it is the fund that covers the most of our operations. And so a lot of time in the budget design and so forth, and in the discussions that we have, kind of are carried through the lens of the general fund, because it really is. It's the most vulnerable, and state statutes do not allow cities and towns to have the most control over it. But this worksheet right here will tell you how the general fund breaks down. And if you look kind of midway through the page here, that fund balance for fiscal year 20 ending period is found right there, that $127,651. And you can see here how that how we get to that calculation by following this worksheet. We will also reference this here in a little bit, but this worksheet. But suffice it at this point to say that the general fund, as well as all of the funds in your budget that we're proposing this evening, do balance. And as a matter of fact, we're not using any reserves or anything beyond projects that you have at least provisionally approved to this point, in the expense of some of the cash balances and other reserves that are out there, typically in the enterprise funds. And so we believe that because we are using dollars, that you have a portion and that we do have on hand and so on, that indeed we're operating in a balanced nature. Certainly within statutory opportunities and within the ordinances that you have put forward, managing these kinds of things as well. We even believe that pending what you decide, we will have the opportunity to bolster some real key reserves, and we're hopeful that that you will find the wisdom in that, and we'll be able to move forward into fiscal year 20 with that protection in place, should we see fluctuations economically occurring in future years here on our near horizon. The other thing that I want to point out here is with respect to this point right here. And I just give you a little bit of a quick preview on the point that we will hopefully demonstrate for you here in a minute. But we based the entire general fund budget upon revenue that is comparable to the actual revenue that we received this year. And so we didn't try to build any growth or revenue enhancement or anything like that into your fiscal year 20 budget, particularly as it relates to the general fund. You have already given us direction, which was very helpful direction, as it relates to the enterprise fund, wherein you talked about, or we talked about, I should say, utility rates and projects and so forth that you'd like to do with the enterprises, the role that the 1% could play in each of those enterprises and so on. So a lot of that direction we had already gleaned from you in previous work sessions leading up to this point. And as a matter of fact, you gave us a lot of budgetary direction as it relates to many of our social services and other community partners and their interest in some of these dollars that we're going to see here tonight as well. And so much of the work, as it really should be, was done with respect to the budget leading up to tonight, although we still have some critical decisions that need to be made. If not this week, hopefully very soon, so that we can have your budget prepared for formal delivery in your council meeting of, I believe it's June 18th. Is that right? Moving forward then, with regard to more in-depth review of what we just brought to your attention, sales and use tax here is a huge piece of the general fund, and that's not a surprise to any of you. So we do spend a lot of time trying to prognosticate what it is that sales tax is going to do. We took the conservative approach, as you already know, of simply looking at what we got this year, or projected to get this year, and we built the budget on those actual receipts versus trying to grow those receipts and sort of betting on the come throughout fiscal year 20. Let me show you what I mean. You can see here as sort of a reference piece what fiscal year 18 did in terms of its actual receipts into the city. As far as 2019 is concerned, the green line here you can see that 2019 actually performed better throughout the year, particularly as it relates to the budgetary bar we set for ourselves a year ago, as shown by this red line right here. I can tell you that this performance right here is really what enabled the releasing of the wages, if you will, the unfreezing of the wages, because we got a lot of surplus through here, through the period of a quarter, that, in my opinion, really made that decision very doable and to have happen. What we anticipate doing with regard to the bar that we want to set for ourselves for fiscal year 20 is demonstrated by this dashed line here. We believe that this dashed line represents probably a more accurate trend line with regard to the actuals that we have experienced thus far in fiscal year 19. We did not try to push the fiscal year 20 projections too far up into here, because we just didn't believe that we had the data that would suggest that we should be that aggressive or ambitious or whatever. And so we set a trend that we think more closely reflects the actuals and the experiences we're having right now for fiscal year 19 as our basis by which fiscal year 20 should be built for the general fund. Because again, sales and use taxes are our bread and butter in our most vulnerable, hard to predict fund of all the funds that we oversee and manage. As it relates to the basis by which we feel like we've got pretty good support for relying upon those numbers to carry into fiscal year 20, we look back over history, and certainly with this perspective, we view our general fund sales tax revenue to be on a slight upward trend from what we experienced back in 15. Now, one of the things that I would point out to, again, hopefully give you some comfort with regard to the basis by which we're using to predict and project one of our chief sources of revenue is the fact that back in 16, right around this time frame, unemployment in Natrona County was between 7 and 8%, which right now, in this period in Natrona County, we are at 4%. And so while there are a number of factors that help me to feel good about the fact that this trend moving forward, at the very least on a flat basis, is probably okay, albeit conservative, is because of at least that notion that by being able to divide that unemployment factor by a whole is pretty reassuring. I can tell you though that we also, I say we, but it was really I spent time with a bunch of the local sort of economic leaders in the community, and a lot of the information they provided me too, at least word of mouth and perhaps even anecdotally, led me to believe that taking a position of where we're at now and anticipating on that type of activity moving into the future years is probably not unrealistic or unreasonable. When you look over time, however, particularly compared to where we were at perhaps our peak of sales tax activity back in 14, we obviously still have some room to grow as it relates to recovery kinds of activity. And so I'm hopeful, particularly at this point, going in that direction, which is good, and certainly not inconsistent with some of the higher points that we've seen recently. We are probably, again, not too far off from what we can see as sort of a median with regard to performance that we're seeing now and performance that we saw in our recent memory as being sort of a high point. But as you can tell, looking at it from a longer perspective, that growth curve doesn't seem to be as profound as perhaps this might look like with regard to this perspective in comparison. Nonetheless, I feel pretty good about it. The other thing I wanted to mention to you too is that over the last 2 years, sales tax actually grew at a rate of 10% each year. And otherwise, as you all know, those 2 years really weren't that remarkable as it relates to a lot of the economic activity that we all witnessed and observed during that period of time. And I'm speaking specifically during, 17 and 18, 19 time frame. So 20% growth over 2 years, 10% annually. I think we will even see 10% at least in revenue growth over the next year. But again, in the effort of, in the spirit of trying to be conservative and not necessarily betting on the come, so to speak, we did not build that type of revenue growth and expectation into the design of your general fund budget. The other thing that we looked at that we thought would be helpful for us, okay, now I'll probably have like 10 slide advances here because my button is not responding. Or at least it's responding more slowly. There we go, thank you. We took a look at the major industry classes for Natrona County. And we got another comparison that shows some interesting information here too. But this is not a chart that you're unfamiliar with. You've seen this before. The blue line here represents mining activity. As we've discussed before, mining is really kind of a misnomer because that really should say energy activity here in Natrona County. I'll tell you, I'm not real pleased that this seems to be going downward, but I do believe that over the next several months we will see some rebounding of that curve, and in my opinion that trend will continue to increase. Up here is retail. Retail is doing really well right now, and that's kind of probably not as intuitive because, as we know, we've had a lot of stores shut down and some of our retail footprint has shrunk in terms of the offerings that we can provide our citizens and those who visit our community. But I'm encouraged to see that that retail is doing so well here right now. And given its command of the real estate here, if retail continues to do well, I think we can feel good that our financial fortunes that Natrona County kind of depends upon should be okay. If you look at this this way, we are comparing here activity that we're experiencing right now compared to activity that we experienced back in 14 when things were kind of on more of a higher plane of activity. A couple things that I find really interesting is I'm amazed that retail trade for this snapshot in time is actually outperforming what retail was doing back in 14. That is amazing to me. Maybe it's just a temporary spike, I don't know, but even still, given what you saw with regard to 14, this is interesting to me. The other thing that's interesting to me, however, and probably more concerning, is the relationship that mining has right now to the activity that we hopefully would want to see here in the next year or so. Mining is not performing near as well, and again, this is more of an energy sector measurement, as it was back in 14. And so I have to think that a lot of our fortunes that we were able to rely upon and enjoy back in those days was a combination of high-performing retail and mining. So I'd like to see that again, and I think that will be an indicator that will show us that we really truly are getting in a strong recovery position. I was kind of surprised to see how little construction provides with regard to the overall view of the economic activity in our county. Now certainly construction for May may be not at its high point throughout the cycle of a sales tax earning period, but nonetheless I would think that our activity here needs to command more of the real estate in order for us to feel really, really good that recovery is aggressive and dependable and maybe here for sort of the shorter long term, if that makes any sense. By the way, if any of you have questions or whatever as I'm going through, just feel free to stop me and we can discuss these things in more detail. So to look at the general fund sort of from a cash balance statement standpoint, this is what we see. I want to draw your attention to these two numbers right here because I think this is another good news item as it relates to the activity of fiscal year 19. We are suggesting to you that fiscal year 19 will see an excess revenue of $1.5 million and a kind of a expense sort of reduction, which of course generates cash as well, of about $500,000. And so all told, we believe that $2 million are potentially available from FY19 activity that you could use to supplement needs that you think the budget in FY20 might have. The only thing that I would suggest with regard to these funds right here is two things. First of all, I would highly recommend that we don't wrap these two resources into operational needs for fiscal year 20. I would hope that if we do use these dollars that we can use them for one-time purposes, one-time investments, and allow those investments to help us versus some of the operational costs that can sometimes hinder us as we move forward from an operational basis, particularly in the general fund. The presence of these two dollars right here suggests that they could play a real critical role. They could play a real critical role in supporting the general fund's reserve. You'll see in your budget message that in order for us to get to the 120-day goal for the general fund reserve, we would need at least $1.5 million to make that mark. We are not suggesting that's what you need to do or that's what you have to do or whatever. This is used to sort of demonstrate how this could fulfill that goal. Now, certainly, I would like to see that reserve goal be met. But the reality is we've got other reserves we need to focus on as well. And you may even want to use some of these dollars to do something for employees also. When you add the business activity of the general fund, you see these things play out. And as we've already talked about, this $127,000 is what we think will be available at the end of fiscal year 20 that you can leverage with decisions you want to make at this point or with decisions you want to make at the end of fiscal year 20. But in any case, we think you will have sort of a fund balance, if you will, over and above what the reserves might require, whether it's here or here, of this amount as an estimate. And as you can see here, that really is an addition of these two figures to get us to that point right there.
Carter?
Please.
What are we required to have in reserves by statute?
Mr. Mayor, statutes don't really have a mandatory reserve requirement for local government.
Okay.
Oftentimes we have heard from a practical standpoint that when the legislature or whatever sees an overwhelming amount of reserves sitting in a city's general fund or enterprise fund or whatever, they get antsy and they don't want to participate with regard to dollars that you would otherwise receive as grants. That is not anything that's formalized. It's just been kind of a topic of debate over the years with regard to the legislature and city councils.
Is 120 kind of a best practices number?
120 is definitely a best practices number, which is why we came forward to you with that in mind. The GFOA suggests that 120 days is not a bad cushion. Practically, we have come to understand that 6 months or a year or whatever probably gets too far to the other end of that continuum. So we think 120 days is a good balance.
Thanks.
All right, any other questions about the general fund? Again, this is kind of the cash balance statement, if you will. Moving forward, to break this down a little further, you can see where some of the operational expenses are being accounted for to make up the big numbers that you see here in the general fund. There's two more numbers that I would add to this list that you should be aware of. We believe that the general fund will actually provide for about $5 million in transfers out, which means that the general fund supports other funds to the tune of $5 million, $3 million of which is included in your leisure services type funds. The rec center, the event center, the ice arena, swimming, those are all represented in that $3 million to $5 million figure that comes out of this fund right here to make other things happen. The other piece that I would like to bring to your attention that I forgot to bring up would have been last week, when we talked about the possibility of implementing some of those value-added positions throughout our organization that have that incentive pay component to it. I thought that I was given direction with regard to the police department to go ahead and implement. And so if I didn't get that right, you gotta tell me, because we would need to change course. On the other hand, what I wanted to do also was get your blessing to roll over $225,000 in funds that council set aside last year to implement some sort of pay for performance program that we talked about this time last year. And so that $225,000 is really untouched. And what I'd like to do is roll it over this year. Your budget accounts for that. If you would like to see that go away and find other ways to support the implementation of the police plan and other plans that we may bring forward to you as well, those dollars would certainly be helpful for those purposes if council would see fit with that. Your budget does assume that. And so if you don't like that idea, let me know, and of course we can reverse that and make something else happen.
Where's that 225 earmarked? Is it in the general fund?
It is in the general fund, and it's actually accounted for in the operating expenditures, albeit not as a current expense. It is a rollover anticipated expense that, again, we didn't access in fiscal year 19 and don't plan to.
Maybe we should stop for a minute and confirm that, because Carter asked me after the meeting if it was his sense that everyone was in supportive, or that he had a majority in supportive of the police department plan, and I thought he did, even though there was some concerns about how quickly would this be implemented into the other programs. Are we good on that? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for clarifying that. I appreciate that confirmation. So anyway, the general fund is really the engine and the heart of a lot of operations that you see throughout our organization. Were it not for the $5 million that the general fund produces for the other operations, things like CATSI, our bill, if you will, to the Public Safety Communications Center and Metro, and again, all the other leisure services and so forth, probably could not operate without those critical funds from this operation. So the general fund has just a huge impact with regard to how well the entire budget does its thing.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting you,
That's
Carter,
okay,
but
no problem.
people may have questions about the municipal band. I learned down the road that is a mill levy. It's built into the property tax, and that we don't decide to allocate that. Really, it is built into the property tax system, and
That's right.
so that's where that money comes from.
And state law.
What's that?
It's the state law.
That's right. Yep. And you can see it on your tax evaluation when you look at it where it comes from. And then you'll be judged.
Municipal band. They get a mill levy. Yeah.
All right, moving on from the general fund, there's a question here that I'd really like you to talk about more and maybe even give us some direction on, as it relates to direct distribution. We're going to move into sort of a live section here with respect to this particular idea. I've mentioned to you a number of times since I've been here that the role that direct distribution has in general fund operations is uncomfortable to me. because direct distribution is built on the premise, from a legislative standpoint, that indeed it is meant to be sort of relegated to one-time uses. It's not meant to be relegated to operational imbalances that you might have in the general fund. And so accordingly, my hope is that we can take steps this budget year to start to work out those direct distribution dollars out of the city's general fund operations. Now, I do believe that pulling those direct distribution dollars into the general fund, which occurred probably 3 years ago or whatever, was an option that you had to take advantage of in order to avert cataclysmic situations in your operations, because that was the time when sales taxes were plummeting, the energy market was plummeting, and cities and towns in Wyoming had little option but to consider some of those more emergent issues like pulling direct distribution dollars into a general fund operational budget. My hope is that we're coming into the period where we may not need to rely upon those funds to balance the city's general fund. You'll notice in your worksheet here, the general fund worksheet looks like this, that the measure of that particular dependence is found kind of towards the bottom of your right-hand side. The parenthetical number here, second from the bottom, is in the amount of $3.75 million. And so that is our dependency on direct distribution to balance the general fund.
That's the delta between those two lines in 20.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And so my hope is that instead of slashing expenses to get rid of that particular delta, we would instead exchange revenue to get rid of that delta. And so you heard me mention a little earlier that while I wholly expect that our revenue, particularly in sales taxes, will grow by another 10% for a third year in a row, we did not build expenses to suck up that revenue growth. And so if indeed we do see that 10% growth over the next year, again for the third year in a row, we will have the opportunity to allow those revenues to be exchanged for direct distribution revenues, not all of them, but some of them, maybe even 50% of them, in order to reduce our reliance upon that source of revenue. What that will mean is, in fiscal year 21, when we design the budget, and we're standing here together in May of next year, we will have to make concerted efforts to not, adjust expenses to suck up those revenues as well. And so if we can maintain that level of operation, if you will, for at least 2 more years, and again, if we assume that 10% is sort of a moderate expected amount of growth for the next 2 years per year, then we should be able to be out of the direct distribution business in our operations in 2 years. And we're hoping that with regard to this sales tax growth coming together here and CPI with regard to the basket of expenses that we see, that in fact we could potentially see these lines cross as early as 22 and maybe as late as 23. So that's what I'm hoping for. If we see sales tax growth at say 12% and we're able to keep operational expenses below that somehow, if you could switch it to 12 for me. This figure here. There we go. Then we will definitely see that occur sometime between 22 and 23. If we see it grow at 14% or 15% or whatever, again, that delta disappears rather quickly.
Question about that, Carter?
Please.
So in 2022, is that the first year we would see the impact of the new census?
That would be, we would actually probably see the first payments of the new census coming in prior to that.
Did you have to make some projections about population on the census to get that orange line?
We did not for this exercise. So
Just left it where it is.
we just left it where it is, that's right. So if we do gain some financial benefit as a result of the census, which I would expect that we would, then this particular percentage is benefited, and again, this delta comes quicker to disappear. The other side of it is, if this expense growth that we potentially control doesn't go as high, which by the way is much greater on a proportionate basis than the revenue growth for that portion of our revenue basket, the delta comes quicker as well. The idea is that when this line crosses, these lines cross, we will then have eliminated our dependence upon direct distribution dollars. And any changes that the legislature makes, which can come on an annual basis, we are less vulnerable to. And that's really what I'd like our position to be as it relates to that funding. Because it's a point of debate every single legislative session, particularly when it comes to the budget legislative session, and it makes me nervous every time. I certainly have experienced the time when even an adjustment of that formula has real negative impacts on cities of our stature or thereabouts. And in some cases, I've seen that adjust some 500,000 to 1.5 million in 1 year. And for us to have that happen without being on a course of this nature means that we have to slash expenses instead of trade revenue in order to absorb that reaction. And that's what I'd hope to avoid. Okay. So the first step that we would take is allow that revenue growth to occur without adjusting our operational expenses to suck up that revenue growth. And I think if you adopt the budget like it is, and use those excess dollars for one-time purposes versus operational purposes, we will be on the road to getting to this point, whenever that should occur. So I'm hopeful that we can do that. Any other questions about this idea?
I think it's a good idea to free ourselves of being tied to that state money. That's certainly may not be a long-term source, and there's a lot of talk about that anyway, but
Right.
if we're not dependent on it, then we're way ahead of the game.
Amen. Thank you, Councilman. I appreciate that. Okay, moving forward then. Let's talk about, okay, whoops. Sorry. The enterprise funds. There we go. The enterprise funds. As I mentioned, in our fund accounting system, it's pretty unusual that we get to use the enterprise funds to offset the needs in the general fund, except by, I should say, policy prescribed conveyances, like buying Tom services to help manage the sewer fund or the water fund, or buying your oversight as the board of directors, so to speak, and so on. HR services, Evan services. It just goes on and on. When we can nail that down to a policy that you've been approved of, then the auditors are good, and we have met that type of compliance as it relates to fund accounting principles. Moving into the sewer fund. Again, kind of a cash balance statement here. We anticipate your beginning cash balance in the sewer fund to be right at $2.1 million, over and above what it is that you have to set aside for reserve purposes, again, based on the policies that y'all have agreed to, which for the enterprises is a little bit different than the general fund. The enterprises are a 90-day operational reserve plus 1 year capital depreciation equivalent, right, Tom? I always mix it up. Is that right? for the capital side of the reserve,
Yeah, and then there's a debt service component.
and then the debt service as well. So this represents what that monetary value is for those three goals. This represents a cash balance beginning fiscal year 20 that kind of represents some of the wealth that the fund has, and we'll show you here in a minute what the graph looks like. After going through the business activity of this particular fund, we do expect that this fund will see a loss. But as you'll see here in a minute what that means, we still expect the financial health based on the delta between these two numbers to be right here. Now when you compare this scenario to your pro forma analysis, you can see why taking a loss in this fund is not a huge issue. This right here is actually the ideal operating condition for the fund. As you can see by the motion of this blue line, that's a measure of the behavior of this fund in terms of the business activity I just showed you on the previous page. The space between these two lines right here is really where you want your funds to operate if you can't be above the green line. Because this represents the limit of the upper limit of your reserves, and this of course represents the lower limit of your reserves. Any activity below this means you're effectively operating in a bankrupt scenario, dropping below the red line anywhere. When you look at the health fund, that's where you see those kinds of things happening. But we've even got good news there too, so I'm excited about that. So this is the sewer fund. This is what you saw back in November, December, January, when we talked about these utilities and so on. And so this shouldn't be too new to you either. Moving into water.
Can I jump back real quick on
Yes,
that
sir.
sewer fund? Are we taking into consideration upgrades and plant maintenance and that kind of stuff?
Thank you for bringing that up. The sewer utility is actually comprised of two funds. The sewer fund here represents the activity that the citizens need to provide by way of rates and those investments. The wastewater treatment plant fund is actually another fund that is set up to manage the physical plant. The problem with that particular fund, it's not a problem, the dynamic with regard to that fund is actually managed by a board that is separate and apart from the council. And so they make those decisions and then bill us as one of their biggest customers. That billing comes as a result of the activity of this fund. It's kind of like the relationship between the refuse and Balefill fund to make the sanitation function happen. So the short answer to your question is, it's the wastewater treatment plant fund that we will access to make those plant improvements happen. That is also the vehicle by which we can assess all of our regional partners for their proportionate share of those improvements. That's why I like that fund, because we could bill out those improvements as well. To go to the part of the capital plan that you'll see discussion in your budget message as well, that deals with the North Platte sanitary sewer improvement, or the interceptor project we've talked so much about. It is the wastewater treatment plant fund that will actually be responsible for repaying the opportunity fund for that project, which you'll recall we're going to the state for to help get some funding from them too. And then of course we will be billed through the sewer fund and the rates that we buy our sewer services from in order to help offset that cost back to the opportunity fund. Hopefully that wasn't too meandering and confusing, but your question brought up a few thoughts in mind. I appreciate that. The water fund also has an interesting relationship with the water treatment plant, because as you know, the water treatment plant is actually a regional plant that they have hired the city of Casper to be the operator for. And they produce all the water that we buy. They also produce the water for other regional partners here in our area. The water fund here shows what it is that we do to try to compensate not only for the cost of buying that water from the regional water facility, but also the cost of maintaining all the pipes and other appurtenances with regard to operating a major water system like we have here in Casper. The business activity of this particular fund would suggest that we will start in a healthy position of almost $3 million over and above the reserve balances that council has suggested we should do to create an additional $1.7 million in business activity and in this case positive impact, to the extent that we will end fiscal year 20 in a stronger position of $4.5 million. Now you'll remember that we have a huge capital investment with regard to our water distribution system. However, oh man, I don't want to give away too many fun secrets yet. The water distribution fund has for a while been operating in, above ideal operating condition. And so, my opinion is, don't do it now. Is it me? Okay. All right. It's me, I know. If this type of activity continues into the next year, and the only way it wouldn't is if we just have miserable water sales throughout the summer, it would be hard for me to come to you and say we need another water rate increase and those kinds of things. Because, again, as long as we're operating here, I feel relatively comfortable. Operating up here is gravy and may be a justification for not necessarily needing rate increases. And I would suggest the same for all of our other funds as well. Unless you have major capital things that you're trying to build up funding for, like you'll see in sanitation, and even probably sewer. Water fund's in good shape.
Carter, we do have that treatment plant we'll need to build for the groundwater at some point, so we have a different savings mechanism for that and some funds we can access from the state, right?
True. And if I understand correctly, although I may not understand that project as well, that probably is a regional
It is.
responsibility. And so we will likely be charged ultimately down the road for a proportionate relationship to that through our rates of water that we buy from them. Moving on to refuse here. You'll remember that refuse is the fund that manages the rates, basically, the revenue generated from rates that our citizens pay into. We will start the year in a positive cash position over and above the reserves that we have mandated to keep. We will have this business activity which will generate an additional $116,000 worth of benefit to yield here at the bottom an overall health, again, over and above our reserve requirement of $278,000. Now this is important for us because those are the dollars that we use to buy our sanitation trucks, our containers and dumpsters and all those kinds of things. This is the fund that the Balefill fund builds in order for them to survive. As you can see here, we're operating within the ideal operating condition. We came close to, pushing into our reserves here, and that was probably for, what we're proposing in the future here will likely be to catch our fleet up and those kinds of things that will, of course, leverage the dollars that we have on hand. But the relationship again with the Balefill is what's interesting and probably unique in terms of accounting for cities and towns here in Wyoming, albeit a very good way to go. The Balefill will start in a healthy cash position over and above the reserves to generate this amount of money into the end of the fiscal year that we're planning for, to hopefully push a $4.2 million infusion back into the fund's balance. That's a really good thing, because the reality is we're going to need a lot of dollars, as you can tell, moving into our out years, because not only do we have to complete the expansion that's taking place out there, but we've also got to deal with closing a cell and reopening a landfill cell, which, as you all know, are huge expenses for a landfill to have on its horizon. So to see these numbers kind of go like this is not something you're unfamiliar with. We've talked about that, and that's kind of expected. At some point, we're going to want to see this taper, and we're going to definitely see a huge hit when those projects come online.
Bob?
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do we anticipate, are we in discussions with any other out-of-county municipalities in addition to what we've already got on board with us?
We are. Yeah, we are in discussions, and it is the brilliance of that type of move that the city of Casper has been doing for years and years that really helps to keep the rates that we as citizens pay into the refuse fund very, very low. The fact is, when you talk about $49 per ton as a tipping fee, that is incredibly low with regard to tipping fees that I'm used to. You know, I'm used to seeing $70 and $80 with respect to tipping fees per ton, of course. And we're held steady at $48, $49, and that's a good place to be. And it's because of those types of relationships, Councilman. The Balefill's doing well as well. We're grateful for the help that you've provided in keeping this fund healthy.
Kristen?
When is the anticipated closing of that cell? I mean, generally speaking, like, is it like a 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
I think 5 years is kind of our near point.
Yeah, I think in fiscal year 24, you're gonna see that,
Okay.
you'll see that blue line take a dip with that heavy capital construction.
And how does that, and so what would the time elapse be before we can fully close that cell will be abandoned, basically?
The one we're filling right now,
Mm-hmm.
it'll probably be simultaneous, we'll be closing one and opening one at the same time.
Okay, all right, so there won't be much overlap. All right. Other questions about any enterprises at this point? Okay, moving on to the health fund. I know, you'll probably want to talk about the health fund again. But I just want to give you some updates with respect to what we assume the budget should say about the health fund. As well as an idea that we thought might help as well. We think that the health fund will be in a negative position starting fiscal year 20, and that's not a position that you didn't expect. Fortunately, the position that you see here is actually substantially improved with regard to what we thought a year or 18 months ago, and because of two things: your willingness to invest in this fund, and secondly, the start of a real positive claim cycle has helped this to be a positive thing. This number would have been dramatically different had those two things not occurred. The reason you see this number being like it is because this is the distance between what we think the reserve ought to be and the consumption of those dollars to potentially get to that point. Obviously, you got business activity as well in the fund. This number right here is a number that we'd like to draw your attention to, in that we believe that we have found a pocket of money that was set aside in the property and liability fund that really was overfunded. And so we're suggesting that that fund really only needs about $200,000 to be a reasonable balance for the property and liability piece of our makeup. And so that freed up $425,000 that we think could be applied towards this balance without having to rely upon the rates and so forth to make up that small portion of funding, relatively small portion of funding. So we're happy to report that if council is okay with our interpretation of those dollars and that property and liability fund, that we would like to move it over to the health fund and start our journey towards getting to this point right here. So, two things need to happen here with the health fund over the next year, and I realize that trying to predict health consumption and medical consumption and so forth is a real dicey thing. But with regard to the resolution that you all passed, I think you're helping us to have a little more stable footing to plan moving forward. And we believe that if expenses don't get out of control or don't go beyond sort of a 4% adder, if you will, moving forward, that we should be able to reduce our distance between this number and where we think our cash position will be by, a reasonable amount. As we move into a live look at this particular fund, do I hit the next button or deal? Nope. Nope. There we go. Are we bringing up the numbers, the table?
That's not the one.
I don't think this is this. This is of this slide. This is the mic.
This isn't live. As you can see here, we're operating beneath the upper limit of our reserve. You're used to seeing this blue line dip further down into this, and we were hopeful that at some point it would crest the broke line, if you will. We would suggest that if we can maintain a reasonable amount of rate increases over the next several years, we think that this year might actually be the last year where we expect a cash infusion from council over and above the rates that the employer provides as a part of their share of the rate increase. Now, that probably sounds pretty nirvana-ish to expect that expenses aren't going to jump or that we aren't going to all of a sudden be back in a bad claims history and so on. And if that does end up happening, then yeah, that'll definitely throw off our theories here. But we're hopeful, because typically these cycles last more than just 1 year. That if we can get a couple more years of reasonable expense containment and ride that cycle out, that positive cycle that does come every 2 to 3 years, that we should be able to get ourselves back into a situation of restoring dollars in that fund to get us to this position here. And we think it can be without cash infusions from the council.
This is consistent with our 1585 split between the city and the employee.
Yes, sir. That's correct. That's correct.
And I'd like to say something about this because much has been made of the fact that we did not increase the employees' premiums over a 3-year span when we weren't giving raises, with the implication that somehow if we had been doing that, we wouldn't have this problem. Well, if you do the math on it, we have a $6 million claims history on average, and the employees are paying 15%. That's $90,000 a year. If you had increased those premiums by 5%, you'd get $45,000 a year. If you did that for 3 consecutive years, you'd have $135,000. Tell me that would have closed this gap. I mean, it's not nothing, but the implication that somehow had we not been asleep at the wheel and raised employees' contribution, we wouldn't have this problem is simply false.
One thing I can tell you, Mr. Mayor.
Unless my math is wrong, correct me if I'm wrong.
I probably can't correct you because I haven't done that math. But what I can say is that over the last several years, there has been a $5 to $6 million loss in this fund. And I think that's probably the more captivating trend that we hope we'll never find ourselves in that position again to try to absorb. And so that's why we would suggest bringing this fund and this analysis and the other analyses that are attached to a rate increase or cash infusion suggestion or whatever, to you every single year and treat this fund like an enterprise from this point forward, so that indeed, since this fund is really supposed to operate independently of other funds in our organization, we just don't find ourselves in that spot again. Nothing can protect us from bad health years. There's very, very little.
And that's what happened.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so hopefully we can work against those trends as best we can. And I think with a continual analysis of these kinds of behaviors and financial impacts and those kinds of things, we can probably do that.
Kristen?
Just to clarify, because you said last year for capital infusion, you mean that there'd be a capital infusion in 1920? Sorry, 19-20, right? You weren't talking about like this current fiscal year that's about to end. You mean
Correct.
next fiscal period?
We
right?
mean the fiscal period we're planning for.
Okay.
That hopefully will be, the last time, at least on our near horizon, that we have to come to you with hat in hand and say, hey,
Yep.
the fund is going to need some cash.
Okay, Mike, did you?
Do I remember correctly, Carter, that last year that blue line was way below the red line? The scale on it was a whole lot different than even the scale here.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, you
Okay,
betcha.
that's really very good to see that.
It's very, very good to see, yeah. And I'll tell you, to remind the Councilman Huber, that happened because council was very, very generous with regard to the cash that this fund needed. Furthermore, we had very positive expense trends this past year that this time last year we did not expect. And so the combination of those two things happening really made a difference. And so, as an employee, I really appreciate that from this council.
Are we lucky or are we good?
Maybe a little of both.
That's-
Which I would accept either one.
That's what I was going to ask though. Is it just more efficient claims management, or is it truly like less claims and healthier scenarios?
Mr. Mayor and Councilman, I would say probably a combination of all three,
Okay.
because we've also had design changes that have brought real dollars to the table too, albeit from a proportionate standpoint, relatively smaller. We still have time working in our favor for those things to help us as well, design changes,
Yep.
that sort of thing. So-
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've also created some incentives for people who are Medicare eligible to use their Medicare instead of stay on the city's pool. Is that correct?
Which is huge.
Is that fair to say, Tracy?
And as of January first, post 65 are no longer on our plan,
Eligible.
January of this year. So we anticipate seeing greater savings on the plan because of that.
That's big.
Okay.
If council decides to go with the state health care or whatever it was that we were talking about,
Yeah.
and we want to go with that, how is it going to affect that?
The reality is, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that if we go to the state plan, our need to have an enterprise fund of this nature really and truly goes away for the most part. Now, joining the state's health fund still requires that we pay our own way. And so that doesn't eliminate the need for analysis so that we know what it is that we'd have to pay in order to play and those kinds of things. But for the most part, being self-funded is dramatically different than being a part of the state's pool. And so,
So would it free up all that money then?
well, it depends. It depends on what our costs are every year to participate in the fund, because we still got to pay for our own history.
Right.
But the good news is, potentially, that the absorption of those kinds of histories that we are feeling the full brunt of by ourselves could make our costs more competitive. That's the hope. That's the theory.
Bigger pool.
Exactly.
Right. Yep. And so we're hopeful that we can provide that analysis to you further into the summer to see if indeed making that change makes sense. Theoretically, to me, it sounds like it would, but you really should have a good analysis of what that means and what the costs are, what the loss of control, its value is to this agency, to this group, and go from there.
Because there is significant loss of control.
Exactly.
There definitely is significant loss of control. In fact, one of the things that made me a little nervous is that the legislature is in control of that design. And so, while you have a board that oversees that and manages on behalf of the state, ultimately the legislature has to decide whether design changes or whatever makes sense. The other thing that I'm not real clear on as it relates to whether or not we should or can or could move in the direction of the state's pool is whether or not the legislature will allow us. I heard some really interesting debate, as I kind of reported on last week, I believe, where some of the legislators don't necessarily buy the view that because you have an attorney general opinion, then all of a sudden it makes it lawful. And I think that's a really interesting debate. I hope it does not precipitate in legislation that would say cities and towns are not allowed, which I'd be very disappointed in.
We can just let Riverton fight that battle, right?
I'd like to help them, because I think that's
I think it's worth, yeah, not just let them do it.
Well, they'll
Support
they'll
them.
plow that ground for us. They're the first ones pushing it. So.
yeah. It's an interesting debate, and like I said, I think it'd be very disappointing if the legislature were to purposefully point out cities and towns as groups that aren't welcome, even though they are legitimate state entities, if you will. It'll be interesting to watch. Very interesting to watch and participate in. As it relates to some of the other concepts and assumptions that we built this fund's budget on, we do anticipate that a 14% increase with respect to the split that council decreed, if you will, in the resolution recently. You'll see that the buy-down plan will continue to be less appealing, probably, to many employees, and the mid plan, if you will, sort of the corpus plan, the original plan, will continue to be more appealing. That wasn't done necessarily by design or anything. I think that's a feature of some of the operating assumptions that each of these plans were designed upon. As you recall, there was actually a third option for city employees at one point in time as well. And in order to save those costs, that those options were costing the overall fund, the decision was made to reduce to these two plan options. This plan option has always been the favored plan option of employees, the largest amount of participation, and I suspect that division will continue as a result of what we're seeing here. This is also a measure of what plan received the most subsidy from the council. If you look at these numbers here. And so the majority of employees got a greater support, if you will, in terms of monthly dollars from the council, whereas the smaller participating plans, while they had previously enjoyed a larger subsidy, that subsidy reduced.
Just for my clarification, when we say employer, is that like kind of just like an inner working transfer as far as like the departments? Is the department the employer?
The city is the employer. You guys are the employer. And so those are the shared costs that you would pay on behalf of the 85% portion of the cost of the
Okay, that are just paid into the fund.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. Billed to the fund. That's exactly right. Other questions? Okay, moving on. The dental plan actually performs better with regard to your support. Again, kind of indicating the amount of subsidy that employees were not enjoying, if you will, relatively speaking. Obviously, these numbers aren't huge, but savings is nice for employees to have, and I think that's a kind of an unintended benefit of what happened here. Oh, this is the part where okay. Thank you. We had a little bit of redundancy there. Just to give you a feel for again what we expect with regard to the fund operating in the condition that we hope we will see. If indeed we keep the premium, or excuse me, the expenses and so forth relatively flat, we will see these numbers go up, and these portions working toward the reserve goal. This doesn't really demonstrate anything I haven't already shared with you, so I won't waste more of your time going through this.
What does it demonstrate? Is this just something that is not going to happen, or?
this is a demonstration of what certainly could happen. If indeed cost to provide insurance goes up
Mhm.
because of bad claim history, if indeed rates don't continue to stay moderately going up and so on, certainly we can see this type of behavior occur. I can't see all the criteria here, and so I'm uncomfortable trying to tell you what that is exactly.
Sort of, well, I mean, roughly, are we basing this on today's rate, today's premium? I mean, well, it looks like we are on the same premium for, you know, the next 4 or 5 years, which is it's just not gonna happen. We don't know which way it's gonna go, but it won't be the same.
Right.
But are we talking about still paying the same rates?
We are talking about an assumption that 10% will be kind of our moderate increase that we would build future assumptions on.
Because
Assuming also
routinely every year your insurance goes up. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just what happens. But, so if this is anticipating that, then we've got a problem in 22.
definitely. I really need to see this in order to be able to answer that question better. If it's just a second.
Wait, what about?
This is not the ideal operating condition to discuss this.
So this is pretty indicative of the health plan at about 2022.
Man, I hope not. I hope not. This would make the state's argument really, really nice. There we go. I'd still like to see the criteria here if I could get a view of what we're talking about. Well, right there.
I mean, that answers any
This is
question.
the reason we have good health fund right here, folks. Right here. Baby Tremel. There we go.
Okay, when the questions get tough, you just show pictures of babies. People get confused.
Distract them. Distract them.
There we go.
Exactly.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Here's the criteria we're assuming. Let's slide back up and look at the behavior of the curve because it's a little more comforting. With those criteria, the fund behaves this way.
So you've solved it then. That other one was without the proposed increases that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that was an iteration of curves in the past. Here's what we're suggesting. This says 7% because it's a half a year of 14% increases for fiscal year 20. We're asking for 914,000, 425 of which is what we're hoping to bring over from the property and liability fund. So the true infusion for fiscal year 20 that we're asking for from you is in the neighborhood of $500,000. That is a dramatically lower infusion that you've seen in recent years. The minimal infusion that you've generously provided has been $1 million in the last couple of years. So to me, this is good news. But what's even better news, even though I'm a little nervous about, making these prophetic statements, if you will, is if we can keep expenses relatively, moderate, we can see moderate increases over the next few years, going back to that earlier portion of my response, that should not require cash infusions, but it will require employer-covered contributions on the 85-15 split.
And the same thing with the employees.
Yes. Yes.
That's not uncommon in the workplace. And 85
I
and
don't
15 is not
think so.
uncommon, and neither
Yeah.
is a yearly increase. And
I agree.
it's not the employer that imposes the illness typically.
Yes.
I mean, it certainly isn't a factor like Carlson or something like that. But,
So Carter, would it be fair to say that with those proposed rate increase percentages that basically each department's going to see a higher percentage of their expenses essentially taken up by the health fund as we go forward? Because 10% is still well above the rate at which other expenses will go up.
You make a good point, Mr. Mayor. I would say that will be a dynamic that departments will have to manage as part of the employer makeup. And so, yeah, those benefit charges will come right to here. And so when you go through your budget and you see those benefit line items and so on, that's how the departments are being assessed for these fees. And you do see those go up more than you have in years past. So you'll see it right there in your line item budgets with each operating cost center. That's how we assess it. Thank you. That looks really good. Okay, don't lose it. Whoa, let's pull it back.
Don't bring the other one back.
Please don't. Let me get nervous here real quick. There we go. All right. So as you can see, moderate expenses, revenues projected to go up at these rates. Hopefully, we don't have to come back to bother you for cash infusions because that's what this measures here. And with any luck, this fund will continue to operate upwards and create cash balances that get us to that $3.2 million, which I'll remind you, and you'll see in your budget message, is a 6-month run out on a 5-year rolling average. So I think that's a pretty reasonable measure, you know, for what this figure ought to be right here. And so with any luck, we'll be at that point in fiscal year 23, fingers crossed. It should be within a typical good cycle that you see with these health funds, but of course, the possibilities exist that it might throw us off our.
No, it's 1 or 2 bad diagnosis though.
Exactly.
$170,000
That's exactly right. So anyway, could be good news. We'll keep fingers crossed, but that doesn't remove, in my opinion, the need to look into the option that the state may be offering us now. There might be some benefits there.
Right.
And Carter, just so that I'm clear, all of that positive performance in part is based on that we would be paying these rate increases that you're talking about.
Yes, sir.
And
That's
so
right.
if someone was to be curmudgeonly about it, they could say, well, we could do a quote cash infusion or call it a rate increase, but still it's gonna cost more one way or the other, whichever way you want to call it.
That's right.
This is a more orderly way of doing it, I think is what you're saying, than if we just, oh, we gotta throw, we gotta pump some more money in there all of a sudden.
Yes, you put it exactly right, Councilman. I prefer the more planned approach of looking forward with what we would anticipate rate increases to be. It certainly helps to know that we can build on a foundation of 8515. And again, we're sharpening that pencil to be able to plan more appropriately and to not have to come back to you on a business plan that's built on, well, if you give us $1 million, we think we can do good, you know, kind of thing.
Maybe Amazon will get the doctor business.
I'm sure I'd be really good at neurosurgery, but nobody will let me try.
Any other questions about this
I-
fund?
If you said
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on. Thank you for the help, Fleur and Tom. Appreciate that. Okay. Can you advance me? There we go. Let's talk about optional 1 cent. As you know, we are moving into 1 cent 16, and a lot of our capital program was built on funds that we hope to get through this effort. And as a matter of fact, the capital agenda was built just like you see here, wherein public safety, streets, and water command the lion's share of the funding, which is very, very consistent with the citizen survey. Moving into the cash balance statement of the fund, the 1% fund, we are already collecting fiscal year $16. As a matter of fact, technically we've been collecting those since probably around February. So we're starting off the year with some of those projects being funded, which is exactly what you want to see happen. We're anticipating fiscal year 20 to generate this by way of receipts for fiscal year 16. However, we really are only slated for just under $12 million based on actual expenses when you include community projects and you also look at some of the other things that 1% is helping to fund, like swimming and CATSI and those kinds of things. We will have a full basket of about 11.7 out of 16 by itself. This number here might lead you to believe that we will have a surplus of receipts. And the reality is, I would be one to urge you to stop short of thinking of these dollars in surplus terms. We need $58 million in the entirety of fiscal year, and 1 cent 16's collection process. And so, in our view, this $4.8 million is really just year 2 collections, kind of head start, if you will, kind of like we've seen in year 1, starting of year 1. And so I would be reluctant to say, hey, let's think of some other projects that we could use these funds for. But rather stick to the agenda that we have put together that you will approve each year as it relates to projects that you would prefer or not prefer or whatever. And then, of course, amortize those projects across these costs and these dollars. Now, as we get closer to year 3 and year 4, and we're starting to see surpluses like this, and we're starting to eclipse that $58 million planning figure that we have built our capital agenda around for the resolution that you passed, etc., then I think we can say, hey, I think we have some surplus funds. And in that circumstance, I would propose, and you'll see in a policy statement here, hopefully we'll get in front of you this summer, that these kinds of surplus dollars, I'm pointing to these dollars, remember, don't think of them as surplus dollars, but surplus dollars could potentially be built into the opportunity fund that has been established since at least 1 cent 14, where you sort of stash those dollars for opportunity projects that come along. The Interceptor project, of course, is your most recent project that has pulled that $7.8 million down, but will eventually be built back up over time as the sewer pays into that fund for the Interceptor project. Nothing really here that I would say is all that earth-shattering, but I would suggest that we are planning on the number of initiatives that you have identified as being potentially supported. One of the biggest. Go ahead, Bobby.
But we also have the perpetual care fund that, while it hasn't done very well from a standpoint of generating money, we also have that one, which was established probably around 1 cent 10 maybe, that takes care of 1 cent projects. So, that's another home for these unallocated dollars. Should we get out to year 3 and they're looking good.
I would agree with that statement, Mr. Mayor, Councilman Hopkins. The perpetual care fund was established to create an interest income that would be dedicated to maintaining 1% buildings. The rec center is a good example. Certainly I've seen the event center take up some of that money in the past. Without a doubt, council can choose to grow that fund so that that corpus gets bigger and generates more interest income over time. But what council has also done with the corpus dollars that reside in perpetual care is used it as an underwriting feature to leverage other projects with other agencies. The Casper Housing Authority is one example. Did we loan money to Regional Water as well through their perpetual care? Okay. Regional Water is another example. Those funds, those entities are paying back into this fund with interest, which has the effect of growing that fund as well. And those dollars are coming into perpetual care.
The vet center at the old Roosevelt School
Right.
project being the
With the Housing Authority, yeah, that's right.
So Carter, now, is this cover all the priority 1 and priority 2 projects listed in the proposed budget?
I think we got most of priority twos included into year one. I wouldn't invite any department heads to disagree if that's not correct, but I think we got most of priority twos in.
That's your chance.
So priority 1 and 2 should be covered at least for fiscal year 20. But it's an ongoing conversation each year because the funds can go up or down, and your priorities might change, et cetera.
Yeah, 15,325 includes 1 and 2.
Good, great.
And we also, when we were giving 1 cent money to the nonprofits for their projects, a lot of those were front-end loaded, if I remember correctly, meaning we allocated the dollars in the first year and not as many in year 2, 3, and 4, if I'm remembering correctly.
Mr. Mayor, you actually have provided me a very helpful segue with regard to a request that we just recently received. And in fact, many of you may have even gotten the same call. Meals on Wheels would like to get their allocation up front because they want to buy that new cargo van. And again, some of you have probably been out there and have heard the comments and so forth about this. They would like to get their $34,722 paid to them up front instead of waiting for those incremental payments over the next 4 years in order for them to take advantage of buying that van and using it in the service delivery that they have. We took that request a step further and figured out which other agencies probably have a similar need. And you will recall that the DDA also has an equipment purchase that they would likely want to have up front versus waiting 4 years to pay off. Hospice has one of those as well. And the health department also has one of those needs as well. The total value of those requests to be funded up front, if council chooses to do so, would be in the neighborhood of $151,000. I would say that given the balance that you're starting with, because we've kind of gotten a head start on the collections, you're probably okay to fund those requests up front. And the agencies understand that when those expenses are had and the equipment is obtained, they don't get to come back to the well and say, hey, whatever. Of course, some of them do, but I mean, that's a separate decision process. But I would say if you want to do it for Meals on Wheels, you can probably do it for the other 3 agencies as well.
Chris?
Those, all the ones you just listed off, 151,000
Right.
total out of 6 million that we've got already.
That we got on hand already, yeah.
I'd say we do it.
Just for our knowledge, what were the other projects? I know you said Meals on Wheels was a van. What are the other requests for?
The DDA wanted equipment relating to their sidewalk plowing effort, if I remember correctly, and again, anybody can correct me if I'm wrong.
4-wheeler and a blade, I believe, 25
Right.
grand.
Yep. 14.5 is what they were looking for there. Hospice wanted 60 for what was it, Fleur? For their rolling stock?
I think it was an HVAC unit. Partial or
Oh, so it wasn't rolling stock then?
No, I think you're right.
it's HVAC.
Okay. And then the Turner County Health, I do recall, they wanted to replace portions of their fleet as well as get some furniture replacement for $41,600.
You wanna?
And if we really if things really went south, I assume there's a priority 2 project or 2 that could wait a little longer.
Absolutely.
If we'd already spent that money.
From a cash flow perspective.
Is everybody okay with us going ahead and doing that? Okay.
Good, thank you. These guys will be happy to know that, that's for sure. One of the things I wanted to take the opportunity to visit with you about, however, is with regard to the role that 1 cent 16 plays in conjunction with a number of the other cash balances that you have allowed projects to be funded through. You'll recall we've had discussions about Fund 30. You'll probably recall we've had discussions about 1 cent 13 and 1 cent 15 and And obviously, Opportunity Fund is funded by 1 cent 14. Those cash balances have allowed you to leverage other projects to be completed. And that's been very helpful because it's helped us to meet some of those priority 1s and 2 needs that Councilman Hopkins recounted here in the budget book. The problem is that a lot of those cash balances are going away because not only have we used them for capital kinds of things, but we've also siphoned some of those dollars to pay for one-time infusions into the health fund. Fund 30 in particular has been one of those providers of that kind of funding. I would suggest that the move to break direct distribution dollars out of our operational environment will help to replenish those dollars that you were otherwise depending on for other capital needs, and help to soften the blow that losing those cash balances that obviously can't be refilled again to make other projects happen. So what I'm proposing is that if we do stick to the course of breaking those direct distribution dollars out, they can be a nice backfill mechanism where some of those cash balances are kind of going away now. So the balance, I think, in replacing and backfilling those dollars can be had if indeed we're lucky enough to generate $2 million a year roughly in exchanged revenue over time. And so it's another plug for that idea, another means by which we can get to that point of hopefully in 2 to 3 years being out of the direct distribution business and not having to rely upon that. Other questions about 1 cent or capital overall? You've given us a ton of feedback about capital. We really appreciate that, and that's helped us to plan very effectively for what we think we're going to need moving into fiscal year 20. So thank you for that time, and I realize it was a bunch of time leading up to this point. Some concerns that we have, obviously I've talked about direct distribution. The good news that we also have is that potentially reserves can be strengthened. I'd like to talk to you about that a little bit further. We just talked about the cash balances declining and so on. We believe the health fund is on a very positive trajectory, very welcome trajectory, and we're just crossing our fingers for things to be happening here. I'd like to talk to you further about the $2 million. As I mentioned at the very, very beginning, we've got $1.5 million in what we think will be surplus revenue for the end of fiscal year 19. We also think that we'll have $500,000 in expenses that we contained and did not or will not need to incur. The direction that I would need at some point throughout your deliberative process here is what you'd like to do with that 1.5 and that 500,000, that $2 million for fiscal year 19. As I mentioned, if we can keep it outside of operational expenses, that would be absolutely ideal. And then we'll still be on course for doing this right here. Some ideas that you could consider. As I mentioned earlier, the general fund reserve could be a very helpful repository for some of those dollars. The health fund reserve could be a helpful repository for some of those dollars. Unless, of course, we decide to go to the state pool and that path becomes the opportunity for us. You could certainly put some of those dollars into perpetual care so that we continue to build that very slowly over time and hopefully improve the interest income that we get to support 1% facilities. The other thing you could think about is doing another year of one-time payments for our employees. I'm not prepared, as you probably saw in the beginning of our presentation here, to suggest that COLAs is something we can accommodate right now. I think it's something that could be accommodated, and I think it's something that might be accommodated in conjunction with potential wage plan restructuring that the classification and compensation study might yield. We don't know what that might be right now, and so I'm not ready to suggest something like that either today. But if indeed you were to consider a one-time payment for employees, we believe that you could do that for $530,000 for employees that are in the general fund. We would also tap about 280, if I remember correctly, $1,000 out of utilities to cover their employees that are working for the utilities, and you would have a $1,000 payment that would be grossed up so that the tax burden would actually reside with the employer and not the employees. And I think any of those options are very feasible and affordable.
Remind me, Carter, where are we with the 1.7? Did we resolve that, or do we have a plan? The overpayment.
The overpayment is figured into your operational costs that you've already seen. And so what we do is we get a net payment, or do we actually write a check?
Yeah, they invoice us. And
They invoice us on a quarterly basis, right? And so we do pay that on a quarterly basis. It's figured into your overall cash balance statement that shows you in the general fund. And so all that's in there, and we still think you can afford some of these things that we're talking about.
Okay, so that's done in what, 18 months? Or is it?
Actually, what's the term of the repayment?
You know, it's 5 years.
5 years, thank you.
The 1% portion has been paid back.
That's paid. And you guys gave us that authority,
Oh,
I want to say a couple, 2 or 3 months ago.
And that was the lion's share of it, wasn't it, Tom?
Even though the lion's share is with the general fund.
It was, okay.
And they were pretty close, but the general fund was a little higher.
Okay, half of it then. Bob?
Thank you, Charlie. Mr. Mayor. We've also got, when our city property is sitting empty with the state office building done, we've got a potential to perhaps do something with that. Obviously, it's gonna need some remodel, no matter what we might wanna do with it, or we put it on the market and market it.
See if we can sell it, sure.
Yeah, resell it and or rent. So that might be another option we wanna consider, but that again is gonna be 2 years down the road.
At least,
Yeah.
yeah, at least.
Well, comments, council, on bonuses versus beefing up reserves versus perpetual care, or some combination?
So was that $1,000 per employee, but grossed up for taxes? Sorry, is that
Yes, ma'am.
every employee across the board?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, we did this the last time, which would have been last year, actually. I don't think that we did it for temporary employees and seasonals, and I can't
Okay.
remember if we did it for regular part-timers or
I
not.
think we did part
It was all just strictly the FT,
Okay.
full-time employees.
Yep.
Employees, excuse me.
Okay.
Would there be room to do at least the part-time?
Mr. Mayor,
I think you'd
Councilman,
want-
there certainly is room, you bet. It would add to the numbers I just quoted you, and we can provide you that analysis perhaps Wednesday evening if you'd like to take this discussion up again. And for that matter, there's a number of things we can bring back to you Wednesday evening, pending any questions that you have tonight, or that you generate tomorrow night, or frankly, between now and the middle of June, end of June, because your formal deliberation of the budget begins tonight, and so you've got 25 to 30 days to make decisions and to give us feedback, and of course, we would love that feedback sooner than later, so we can be sure that your documents are prepared for everything being formally considered on June 18th.
Well, we may as well talk about it now. We've got a few minutes, and we've kind of laid out the problem, so.
If we were to include part-time employees, I mean, typically speaking, obviously we can do whatever we decide on, but typically speaking, it would just be a lower dollar amount as far as like,
It would be.
so maybe whatever.
Would it be something?
Yes.
I like that.
We've got basically $2 million to decide what to do with. Chris?
I think it's really important that we strengthen that reserve, minimize any kind of dependency whatsoever on direct distribution. And so, you know, we ride the roller coaster like everybody else, and things are looking up right now, and it's gonna hit us again in 5 to 8 years. It will happen, and the next council will be wondering how we get through, so, I think those are critical areas to address right away, and when you go into that slump, the state starts talking about pulling back that state money, and if we're dependent on it, just as if we were using 1 cent money, for operations, we would be in a jam.
Governor Mead was such a strong proponent of local government, and we're still trying to find out where that is in Governor Gordon's list of priorities. Hopefully it'll be at the same level, but we just don't know. Mike?
Well, and Mr. Mayor, one of the things that's a cloud that hangs out there over the horizon for me is I remember at the WAM meeting in February, and I've had people just flat look at me and say, well, you're lying about that. They didn't tell you that. But the guys from Rocky Mountain Power were there, and my understanding of what they were saying is that they think that coal is over. And if that's accurate, you know, this direct distribution from the state is gonna be something that, you know, we're gonna have, like Councilman Walsh said, we're not gonna be really be relied on. So I think we do need to protect that reserve, but I absolutely think we need to take care of our employees also, and I apologize for being late, but at least I got here like I told you I wouldn't be here. I'm sure you guys all rejoiced when you saw me come in, but I don't know if anything was talked about, the budget proposal, I didn't see anything in there that looked like any kind of raises for employees or anything, so I think we need to do something to take care
Just
of
their
them.
steps.
I don't like one-time bonuses. I like percentage raises for people a lot better, but, so we gotta balance
If
that.
you can afford it.
Mhm.
Once you do that, you're committed
Yeah.
indefinitely.
Exactly, versus a one-time bonus where we know what this year looks like. We can see how that affects us, where we don't know what it looks like 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, and we can't really retract that without a lot of pain.
And then just in terms of the political context, the formula is also for grabs.
Absolutely.
And there has been a move toward use of more direct distribution dollars for the smaller communities that really have to have that for just basic operations. And so we may get a smaller proportion of that even if it's approved. So we'll see how that plays out from here. So, yeah, I agree, Chris, that the faster we can get
I agree.
those curves to meet, the better.
So you said 530 from the general, roughly speaking, and 280 from the utilities. So when we're talking about this 2 million, it's only the 530 that we're considering that would reduce that, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So we'd still have the 1.5 roughly to toss into reserves.
Roughly.
Roughly, yeah.
How close does that bring us to 4 months?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, 1.5 would get us there. It would put us right at that 15.8.
And we're on track to fix the health fund without anything dramatic. If things, unless we have, like Chris says, we have some people get really sick.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
That's why we've got reserves too,
Yeah.
so.
Yep.
For those times, yeah. I'm less interested in building up the corpus of the perpetual care fund. I know the long-term goal is to get it to $50 million when it was first established, but I don't know where that figure came from. But in today's interest rate environment, I mean, it's just not going to give us a lot of spendable funds. And so adding $1,000 to it now would be negligible. I mean, it's obviously a good thing to do over the long term, but I'd rather have us be in a healthier position before we put money in there. That's my opinion.
Do we know what it makes on the interest? Well, I guess I don't know any of it. What's the amount we've got in it, and then what are we seeing as a return on that?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, we've got 28.5 in between 29 million. We budgeted some $500,000 to $600,000 in interest income. that I don't think we budgeted even the whole thing yet for that expense, but that's what it generates annually in interest income.
And some of that is the interest on the loans that we made out of it to the Casper Housing Authority.
Well, actually, Mr. Mayor, the $500,000 to $600,000 is the interest income that we derive from the current corpus
Oh, okay.
of
That's good.
28.5 to 29 million.
And you said that's what we budgeted, 500 to 600 for the.
Correct.
So, and that's per year. So
Right.
basically, if we took that money out of there, we've got 60 years of $500 to $600 or 600,000. Is it worth it?
To take it out of the perpetual?
No, to maintain the perpetual fund.
Oh, I see.
At the rate you've got budgeted, let's just say we got 50 years of that same flat number.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that's an interesting question. And we can certainly run more analysis for you to look at that more closely. But, yeah, I think you're right. If we took out some portion in order to leverage other priorities, be it capital or operational or whatever, there's quite a corpus in there. Big piece.
And maybe I'm just not educated on enough, but just on those numbers, that's what it looks like. And so, well, it was just 2 years ago when Liz was doing the budget, and we had talk about shutting major aspects of things down. Liz and Tracy both were doing it. And now we're getting on top of things, and we can right-size a lot of these things, or a lot of our funds, that we couldn't touch then.
Right.
And so I don't understand the need to continue with the perpetual care fund when that's what we're making a year, and so we've got, beyond my lifetime, that contribution into it, and maybe that's a simplistic view of things, but.
Where is that money? Are we just, I don't even know like where exactly, but like, is it like just at a financial institution? Is it at, or are we talking like open market, like stocks and securities?
Mr. Mayor, do you mind if I ask Tom that question? I'm not totally sure what, to be honest.
We lost
That's
it.
not the question, where is the investment at?
Yes.
What
Most
type
of
of-
the DA Davis and.
Okay, perfect. So like market.
It's
Yeah.
market, yes.
Okay. And since it's sitting in there and we're making interest on it, I mean, so I'm assuming city council is the direction for how it got put in there.
Correct.
Okay, so there wasn't any type of like permanent endowment wording as far as like the city council would have the, that's, I don't want to say right, but like the permission, I don't know, in order to extract those funds, or is there like some sort of wording about like permanent endowment where it just cannot be touched whatsoever?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, it's a policy
Okay.
that was enacted by this group, and this group has the authority to change that policy. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Personally, I'd like to defer any decisions about that for a time when we're really at a
When we need it.
semi-catastrophe.
Yeah.
To me, it's a respect thing. Previous councils scrimped and saved to build that fund up, and if we were to spend it on operating expenses, I just wouldn't feel right about that.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I absolutely agree with you. I think that if the world came to an end and everybody was gonna starve and everything, then yeah, invade that. Short of that, I have no appetite at all for touching that. But it gets to a very basic principle that one council, this council can't oblige future councils for what to do. And we can go back and undo almost everything that anybody before us has done. It's not a good idea to do that, but potentially. And so when you ask that question, it kind of, I think, gets back to that basic thing. But I would have no appetite for invading that unless it was just in the most absolutely dire of circumstances.
Bob?
I concur, and Dick Sadler's watching. He was the guy that invented the.
Oh, was he?
Yeah,
Okay.
he invented the perpetual care
That's a
fund in
safe
about
one,
1 cent eight. And I don't remember what the first allocation was, but it was probably, I think it was on the order of $10 million out of 1 cent eight that started the perpetual care fund, and several other councils have added to that, because the position we're in now with perpetual care is not because the market was good for perpetual care income. It's essentially bond funds is what it boils down to, and not a very good one at that. So,
We were able to add a significant amount.
yeah, but it's not been a normal market for the last 10 years in bonds.
Yeah.
Not at all normal.
Yeah, it
So-
could change, and it could become a more substantial annual figure,
Yeah.
so, yeah. Okay.
Just on the concept of undoing what previous councils have done, we're gonna come up with things as this body that we think are genius, and they don't turn out to be what it looks like. And I hope that no one feels they owe me an obligation to carry on with an idea that didn't come out the way you wanted it, just out of professional courtesy or something like that.
I think it's a fair question. I would, but my opinion is to leave it alone right now.
Just
So-
really quick, because obviously I don't have as much of a history. So you said community housing, we loaned some funds out of here. Is that from the 28, or is that separate from the
It was
28?
separate
Well, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I think the corpus was probably closer to 30 million when indeed the loan was made. I don't remember exactly the amount that was provided to that or regional water, but those dollars are being paid back, and they are being paid back with interest, which, you know, is a good thing for perpetual care and ultimately for the community, because we've got good facilities as a result of that.
And part of the argument was we're getting a higher interest rate with those loans than we were getting a return.
In the open
on
market.
corpus.
Oh no, that was I was just doing the math for as far as like what that return is, and as you can imagine, it is painfully low. So that's why I was just asking if there was like a portion that I wasn't knowing, like calculating it on, but okay.
Okay, we're back to the 2 million. I guess we should do let's do it one at a time. Okay, one of the proposals on the table would be to give employees $1,000 of tax-adjusted bonus, with possibly including a smaller amount for part-time employees, which would of course reduce the amount that we would have to build up the reserve fund. With discussion of whether we should do the bonuses.
Approximately how much would that consume?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, with what I proposed, I would really only propose the $530,000 that would be the general fund's obligation to come out of the $2 million balance. I would suggest that the utilities would cover their own and not touch that balance, thereby leaving more money available for other things that you might want to do. So $530.
Thank you.
Without doing part-time.
Without doing part-time, that's correct. That's correct.
The accountant in me's got to ask. When we're saying tax adjusted, we just mean for like FICA, right? Like not like federal withholding, since like federal withholding is different, like on an individual basis. We're just talking about like employment taxes.
To get a check for $1,000.
We're talking net to employee.
Their net would
Yeah.
be $1,000. Yep.
Okay.
We pick up the Social Security and
The other withholdings, yeah.
The only reason I ask that is obviously like if I'm withholding 0 and Steve's withholding 4, I basically just got more of a benefit. That's the only reason I bring it up, is that sometimes when you see that gross up, it's just grossing up the employment taxes, because that's equivalent across the board, where the withholdings would still be on the onus of the employee. Just
we
saying.
can do it any way we want to do it. Or not do it at all. Other opinions about the bonus? I mean, we have it in our power to try to do a COLA too, but that's a whole different discussion and more expensive.
It is.
I know that this is hard on the top of the head, off the top of your heads. How many part-time employees in the general fund do we roughly have? Sorry, I know that is so detailed to ask you off the top of your head. Because I'm assuming the utilities has
They do.
quite a few part-time employees as well.
We can put those numbers together for you.
We don't
Bring
have
them
to
back
decide
Wednesday.
tonight, but at least let's get a sense of council's priorities.
How many full-timers do you have?
Tracy, what's the full-time count right now?
I think it's 485?
495.
485, does that sound right?
Is that the number you used, Tom, for that 530 calculation?
No, that would be citywide, right, full-time?
Oh, fuck, 495 would be
For
city.
general fund would not be.
Oh, for general fund, yeah.
It'd be about
Yeah,
two-thirds of
broken
that.
out for general fund, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So citywide, roughly 500, two-thirds of that would be general fund.
Our opinions, not all at once.
Payable when?
Say again, Bob?
Payable when?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I'd say July 1, thereabouts.
I'm good.
I'd like to make a point though on what was said though. I think that if in fact people are claiming differently, then there would be a difference in, I'd rather see it just be $1,000 per employee and they take care of the taxes themselves because by their choice of what is withheld. And then he keeps it at 500,000. You still have 15 or 1.5 mil that could go back into the reserve, which I totally agree that that's where that should go. So that's kind of like, that's what I'd like to see the split to be. Let them take care of their own. It's not that much money that they're gonna lose out of that 1,000.
Treat it like their paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
But we'd still cover the, oh gosh, what is it, 7 point? I was gonna say, I'm trying to do the math in my head, but I don't know, 7.35? 7.65. And so we could still cover that part, obviously, as far as,
The Social Security you're talking
yeah,
about?
and Medicare.
Well, I've had 2 thumbs up.
I'm not participating in the wage part.
Okay.
Good move.
Still thinking, Ray?
Yeah, I'm thinking.
So, Mr. Mayor, while some of the other councilors are thinking, it sounds like I'm hearing actually 2 variations of the idea. One would be to simply make the payment gross to employees. The other would be potentially a hybrid of a gross payment wherein we'd cover some of the withholdings and they would cover others.
Yeah, we cover the quote-unquote taxes, and they would cover, it's still taxes, but the federal withholding.
How
Okay.
difficult would that be,
It's
Tracy?
actually Tom with payroll that does that part, so he's a better person to ask.
Big problem or little problem to do that?
It's not insurmountable, obviously, it's gonna take more calculation. And if I could, just to clarify too, on the federal withholding, when there's lump sums like that, it's 25%, so that's calculated.
Oh.
So if you're in, depending which bracket you're in, some people may benefit a little more, but you may get some of that back.
But the withholding would be flat across the board.
It's 25, yeah, regardless of what your tax bracket is, it's 25%, and then it's the FICA.
Or how many exemptions you've claimed?
Pardon?
Or how many exemptions?
It doesn't make any difference.
No, like he's saying, like your W-4 that you filled out isn't, like on the lump sum payments, it's not basically taken into account, it's just like a 25 flat.
All right, does that change anybody's opinion?
That does,
It's
yeah.
high.
It's high.
I'd say the average person probably doesn't have an effective tax rate of 25%, but
Bob?
Want to ask, rough numbers, what's our median salary? Rough numbers.
Moving around.
Average, I do have it.
oh, look at that.
Show a picture of the baby.
Average full-time salary is 62,000.
I'm sorry?
62,554.
But that's the mean, not the median.
Average.
That's median.
And full-time.
That's the mean.
Yes.
Me, yeah.
So that comes pretty close. If we do $1,000, it comes pretty close to the 2% CPI. If you were talking 1.7, 1.8.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So, I got another thumb up. Chris is abstaining. Steve, you still thinking?
Now are we voting on net or gross?
Yeah, at this point.
Show a picture of the
if I understand what was on
This
the
would
floor.
be
Hurry, put it
where we would give them the 1,000 and we would pay the withholding. again, back to the original proposal.
My understanding is that's what's on the table right now, the original proposal, which would net everything to $1,000 per.
I'm trying to see if we got 5 thumbs up to do a bonus.
I'm on board with the bonus. We can
Oh.
figure out the gross and net here in a second if you want to.
Cause I think we would
Okay.
probably like to see like maybe something like
We'll recount.
250 for part-time, and like see what that looks like total, or,
I'd I'd like to see at least the part-time employees get something, somehow, some way. With the full-time, looking at getting 1,000, some of the full-time or part-time employees aren't putting in the hours, but they're putting in the same work. So, I like to advocate for the little guys.
Would you wanna do that proportional to their hours, or just make it the 50% for all, every part-time, or something like that? Okay, Mike?
I'm real sympathetic to part-time employees being treated fairly. But, you know, is that a part-time employee that works in the wintertime? Or do they have to be employed as of July 1st? There are some, to me, there's some real kind of things. And part of what, you know, what I'm looking at is some way to try to groom and to take care of our permanent workforce. You know, I've always felt that, excuse me, rather than having so many part-time employees, and this is changing subjects a little bit, that I'd like to see the city have a category of city worker, where in the summertime we work at the cemetery or in the parks, in the wintertime you're shoveling snow or you're working at Togadon or something like that. Now, if you're talking about somebody like that is in essence employed year-round, but to me it would just be really tough to say, well, okay, you're a part-time employee because you mowed lawns in the summer, and so you're on the payroll July 1st, you get this, but you're a lifty at the ski area,
Exactly.
you're not on the payroll right now, so, or do we go back and recapture those guys and give them, so I see that part-time thing being very hard to
What
work.
about, you just hired a guy to mow the lawn, and
Yeah.
he worked 1 week and got a $500 bonus?
I'll take that job.
So I'm not
I agree.
talking about any compensation, but I bet Tracy could give us some insight on the different categories of types of employees, and it might cover what you're thinking about.
Yeah, 'cause for me, I'm looking at like the part-time employee that's been there for a year at the rec center, that there's not a full-time position, so they're sticking around as part-time, waiting possibly for that full-time position to open up that they want to do, whether it's rec center or wherever it might be. I know that I think it's the landfill has some part-time people that's been there for a while. Those are who I'm talking about, that it's like, let's not forget those guys that's been there for years as part-time. Maybe they choose to be part-time, but they've been there for a long time. Let's
Tracy,
take care of them.
Can we make a distinction between part-time and seasonal?
Yes. So, Mr. Mayor, council members, we do have categories of regular part-time employees, and they average about 30 hours a week, and they're on consistently on payroll. Then we have seasonal employees who work just for a season, and then we have variable employees who are sporadic workers, and they have to work within a 6-month period of time where they get removed from payroll. So we do have those classifications already set up.
How would people feel about compensating part-time permanent and leaving the seasonal employees out of this discussion? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm getting some head nods and thumb. All right, so if we did maybe a $500 bonus for the part-time permanents,
Be awesome.
$1,000 for full-time employees, and the city picks up the cost of the taxes, since they seem to be standardized.
If we could just see the numbers, 25% seems excessively high.
Well,
So if we could just maybe see the numbers.
The 530 would cover that, was your,
The 530 would cover that.
cover the
With the 25.
$1,000, everybody gets a $1,000 check, plus we pay, and it costs us 530, plus whatever it costs us to do the part-time, which I assume is not gonna be a huge amount of money, right, Tracy?
No, I'm thinking 150 to 200 maybe. She said 200.
Was
So
it that
a lot
many?
of our folks are variable as well. Maybe they might teach a class at the rec center for 4 hours a month. You know, in the spirit of this conversation, I'm thinking you're not going down that road. So.
No, I'm thinking of lifeguards that's sitting there part-time, but they're there all year long. I'm thinking of those guys.
Yeah, not the
Front
ones,
ones.
not the ones we just hired for the outdoor pools
Yeah.
for 8
Right.
weeks.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. All right, so can you get us the numbers on what that would, because it would add some amount to add these part-time permanent employees, but it doesn't sound like it'll be a huge amount, and we'd still have a significant remaining amount to apply to the reserves. Not
But you're
quite.
talking the $500 level for part-time.
Right. So, it sounds like from this conversation that maybe that cost of the bonus would maybe go up to, 700,000 maybe, and then we would still have 1.3 to apply to the reserves if we did this. If that's just a guesstimate. Does that sound about maybe right or pretty close? Okay.
One quick question, I've forgotten when they become benefited employees in terms of insurance.
That is if they work the 30 hours, we have to offer if it's consistent, that they work averaging 30 hours, and we have to offer it
Okay.
to them, but we rarely have anybody that takes this.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
How about just a tentative thumbs up and then come back with a figure for us before we finally say okay?
Is Wednesday okay for that?
Is that all right with everybody? Find out Wednesday what this is gonna cost?
We'll do it.
Okay?
Thank you. Thank you
Good.
very much.
And then the remainder would go into general fund reserves, or do people have another opinion about that, or
No,
health
it's
fund
kinda
or
like
something
general
else?
fund.
Okay. Okay, general fund reserves it is, okay.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, what else do we need to do?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, the purposes tonight was to really introduce the major theoretical components that we use to design your budget. And unless there's other things you'd like us to dive into on a more detailed basis for Wednesday night, we could prepare for that tomorrow and of course Wednesday morning and bring that forward. Otherwise, we do have on the agenda the need to discuss the claims proposal, as it were, and certainly Wednesday night would be incredibly helpful for that dialogue to come to some conclusion, potentially.
For claims.
For claims, yes.
Any other information people would want Carter and his staff to put together for us ahead of Wednesday, because that will be our last discussion of the budget before we go to final approval in June.
Unless council would like an additional meeting, yeah.
Unless we need more time, so. Steve?
I just have a real quick question. Is there a, maybe I'm missing this somewhere, but do we, for these fund numbers, do we have like a sheet that tells us what those are for?
We can put that together, absolutely.
I would appreciate that. too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for doing that.
No problem, no problem.
And I guess going back to Kristen's concern about approving the plan for the police department, is there some point where you could project for us how quickly we would be able to go through that process with the other departments? Because I think that's a legitimate concern people would have, is why police and why not me?
The only I mean, just use myself as an example, that way it doesn't, let's just say I worked in, accounting's gonna be the obvious one, the accounting department, and the accounting department's slated to be like the second to last. But let's say next month I'm graduating with my master's degree, and I'm assuming that one of the performance factors is gonna be, you get your master's, then, you get this increase. So, in theory, be like, well, the police department got implemented this month, I get my master's next month, but basically I'm losing out on that incentive, until 18 months from now when the accounting department comes up for the review and implementation of their performance plan.
Have you had a chance to even discuss what the sequence would be at this point?
Mr. Mayor, we Councilwoman, we definitely have ideas that we can bring forward and, discuss with council as early as this summer. Some of the more probably finer detail that we would probably lack would be gathered during the class and comp study.
Oh,
And
that's
so
right.
for some of those,
Sure.
for some of those options and opportunities that study would involve, with everything going smoothly potentially with council and council identifying the scope relatively quickly, which again we think we can do this summer with you, we probably won't see those results until the new year, would be my guess.
Would it, Steve?
Well, I just want to clarify from the other night. First of all, in the class and comp study, I particularly was asking if we could have some information brought to us as far as what it entails, the cost behind it, how it's going to be used. And then just to clarify, my comment the other night on as far as the police department went is I had the privilege of being able to see how that program was put together, and I agree with that program. And that what I meant the other night was that if I were asked to implement it, yes, that I definitely would, because it's something that's in front of me, tangible, I can read it and understand it. Wasn't necessarily saying move forward to do it today. I'm just saying that I would give a thumbs up on it. Whereas the rest of the organization, we do not have that in front of us. We don't have a plan in front of us, and so I am not inclined to give a thumbs up to move forward on implementing anything until we can actually, just like in the police departments, being able to look at their program and see how that would work. I would like to see the same thing brought in front of us for the rest of the organization, and not just give a thumbs up to go do what you think will work. And not saying that that's a bad thing and that we don't have faith in anybody, but I'd rather be able to see it, just like we saw the police departments, before giving a thumbs up to move forward.
Mr. Mayor, I think I heard that, and I think we're gonna have something like that, at least in the beginning pieces and parts this summer. But I really do think that a full build out of a structure similar to what the PD and fire and others might have, I would probably defer until that class and comp is done, where I think some of the other major pieces may be identified that we didn't think about. And so that probably won't come until closer to the end of the year, or even maybe at the beginning of the new year.
Would it be fair to give the managers the green light to say that council is interested in seeing how this would play out in the other departments and would be disposed to think favorably about a plan that was similar to the police department, if it, or is it too early to even say something? I'm just kind of worried about the morale things too, that, people, it might be healthy for people to hear that message that we're working on it.
I'm not opposed to the analysis and putting things together. I want that done. I'm just saying that when you're coming to us to ask us to implement something that we haven't seen, that's the only thing that I'm against at this point.
I agree. Yeah, I'm not arguing for implementation. I just want to make sure people know we're interested in trying to do something similar, if it makes sense.
I think if we have some more details on what the class and comp study will provide us, that would help.
Bonuses have, you're the HR expert, Tracy, but what I understand is bonuses have a very short-term impact on morale. And it's nice until that money's gone, and then people are back earning the same wage that they were earning before. So.
Mr. Mayor, can I have one more thing? Mr. Mayor, members of council, it certainly is my plan to bring you a class and comp proposal so that you can help identify the scope that you'd like to see as well. We will not move forward on that rollout of that study without council giving us the thumbs up on even what the study looks like. So that scope will be identified by council, it'll be blessed by council, and ultimately pieces and parts, or maybe all of it, will need to be implemented at council's approval as well. So the council's gonna have a lot of opportunity to weigh in on various aspects of this.
We don't have to do this evening, but, and maybe this is getting down into the weeds, but we did hear a proposal about restorative justice that I thought we deferred to the budget discussion for the upcoming year to see if that was an appropriate thing to include in the police budget. And I didn't look to even see if it was in there.
Mr. Mayor, we did not make any proposals with respect to restorative justice.
Chris?
Well, I was thinking that was last year around this time, and it was funding of a position, at least one, maybe 1.5, on a position that already exists at the police department. And I don't recall us saying anything about bringing it back, unless there's a different one.
No, I couldn't remember where we left it, so without a position, you don't have a program, so. And we do have a new council since then.
And Mr. Mayor, we do have Jen Minor still working in that capacity. What we don't have is the added employees I think Councilman Walsh was referring to support that position. Unless I completely misunderstand, Chief.
I did not present that, I did present, I'm sorry, Mayor,
Please.
Council, in the budget that is before you, there is not an additional position. There has been discussions with the city manager on a need to supplement the restorative justice and the community services aspect of the sentence offenders completing their community service. That's in the discussionary phase with the city manager.
Okay, but this is the time of year when we make those decisions from a budgetary standpoint, so. But you're not proposing that we make any increases in the size of that program at this time?
Not at this point.
Anybody want to?
I love restorative justice, but I also understand the fact that, you know, what we need, the wants versus needs, and I'm a huge supporter of restorative justice. I've seen its capabilities and what it does in the community, what it can do for everybody involved, but I also understand what our needs and our wants where we need to be at too, which is unfortunate, but it's the nature of the beast. So.
I just bring it up because it's been a while since we heard that data, but if you believe the data, you save money in the amount of jail days that you buy, and that it essentially pays for itself over time if you believe the numbers.
According to the data, yeah, it's
because it's very expensive for us to put people in.
It is, yeah. That's the other side of it. It's hard. So.
Detention centers. Okay. Any other comments on that? We just like Chris to say something else.
No.
Okay. All right. Are we ready to adjourn then?
I think so.
Are there any other questions?
I'll be going over this with a fine-tooth comb tonight. Until about 3 in the morning, Carter.
As usual.
As usual.
And you will have it memorized up to page 402.
Carter and I have a final quiz to start our Tuesday session.
That's right.
All right, so but you're accepting emails if people are going through this and there's a question.
Absolutely.
Just shoot an email and we'll
Please
cover
do.
that stuff Wednesday and you know, maybe we'll wrap this up quickly Wednesday. We'll see.
Thanks, guys.
All right, let's adjourn.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Well done.
I'm gonna double check your
I would appreciate it.
So.